Well, in 1980, I was actually working on solar cells. And so that's a whole part of my career that the normal physics people are not aware of. And I continue to work on solar cells to the present day. In fact, the company I founded holds the world record since 2011, has held the world record on solar cell efficiency. And it looks like that record will stand for quite a few more years. It was actually a rather direct connection. So one of the things that I realized about solar cells is that their performance was completely controlled by spontaneous emission. Actually, it wasn't me who first realized that, it was Shockley himself. And in his paper on solar cell efficiency on the fundamental limits, it was always balanced against emission of light back to the sky. So there was a detailed balancing, and that's what Shockley is famous for many things, but that is a pretty major thing. And so there was always this thing in my mind of controlling spontaneous emission. And the result of that was that when later on I stopped working on solar cells and came to work at Bell Communications Research, which was very interested in laser communication. And laser also has that property that it's limited by spontaneous emission in the sense of the threshold current. So I had in mind various schemes for controlling spontaneous emission. It wasn't just myself. There were many people around the world who were thinking about controlling spontaneous emission in those days. And what was very popular, which has now been forgotten, is there was this concept called the microcavity, which was essentially a VCSEL cavity today, we would call that. And they had in mind that by having a dielectric reflector above and below, you could suppress spontaneous emission. This was actually published around that time, but with metal reflectors. But the dielectric, and the metal reflectors only worked in one polarization. The dielectric reflectors didn't actually work. So there were perhaps half a dozen papers published in good journals saying that they were going to control spontaneous emission with a dielectric microcavity. And I thought to myself, and I said, well, that can't possibly work because it's a very good mirror vertically, but in the sideways directions, the light would still come out and you'd have almost no effect. So then I sat down and said, well, we need periodicity in the other two dimensions as well. And so I started drawing lines on a page, and I sort of squinted at the page, and the lines merged together, and it looked like a checkerboard. And then I said, well, checkerboard, okay, that's good. What do I do in the third dimension? So I was thinking about a three-dimensional checkerboard. And a three-dimensional checkerboard is face-centered cubic. And then I looked at the Brillouin zone for face-centered cubic, and I realized it was actually a very favorable condition for blocking light in all directions of space, with very little difference in photon energy between the W point, let's say, and the L point, if you speak that language, for face-centered cubic Brillouin zones. And so then I realized that the checkerboard was not some crazy choice, that actually it was a very sensible choice, and it was a rather non-trivial conclusion. And when I realized that that was a non-trivial conclusion, then it dawned on me that I had something. And that whole process that I've just described took me about 2 weeks. So it was 2 weeks of intense thinking, and everything fell into place. More Dan Kleppner, because Dan Kleppner had published a paper with the metal mirrors. And that had also influenced all the quantum optics people to consider the vertical cavity, what they called a microcavity at that time. And it was specifically my rejection of the microcavity that led me to try to make a three-dimensional cavity. Well, of course, this was all very important work, and I tended to follow it. I did not get personally involved. I was more toward the practical side, in terms of having light emitters that could be used for telecommunication. I was working at Bell Labs where I could do anything, but I felt that I should do something related to communication. Those words, it's very hard to remember when those words were first put together. And it must have been around that time. Of course, nano-optics has many meanings. You have optical structures that are nano. And today you have metallic structures that really are nano. But you also had quantum wells. It was a period, it was about 10 years after quantum wells first emerged, and they had interesting optical properties. So maybe that was the first expression of nano-optics. It did not refer so much to optics as to the material itself, which was at the nanoscale. Everybody has a different challenge, and it's very hard to know in advance which ones are going to turn out to be important. I myself am, and I'll describe it here at this meeting, I'm very interested in making LEDs that are faster than lasers. And I think this is sort of an overlooked possibility. And using optical antennas, and optical antennas are very nano. We're down at the 10 nanometer level and below. We've not had that technology since Heinrich Hertz came along. He was the one who originated radio antennas. But we should have been doing antennas in optics, but we just couldn't make things that small. But now we are making things that small, so it makes sense to reconsider the role of antennas in optics. And that's quite interesting. I think part of what makes it interesting is antennas rather disappeared from physics immediately after World War II. And so you could read excellent electrodynamics books, electromagnetics books in physics, wonderful books like Jackson, which were important historical books that trained 2 generations of physicists, and yet you don't learn anything about antennas really. And so it became forgotten. So now we have an opportunity to bring antennas back into optics, and it'll be very interesting. It's already been interesting, but it'll become more interesting, as you know. Well, we have different aspects. Of course, the quantum well is through and through technology. Almost all light emitters and lasers and LEDs, they're almost all quantum wells of one form or another, or quantum dots in some cases. So the question is whether we can bring metal optics into, obviously it's a research topic, it has fundamental questions, but can it be made into a practical device? Can it, for example, overcome the inherent losses and that you end up with something that's useful? And generally speaking, to be useful, I would say 50% efficiency is a good threshold. So we need to maintain 50% efficiency while achieving something new that the commercial world needs, that humanity needs. And so that's our obligation as scientists, to try to solve that problem. I was actually, in the 70s, I was actually working on laser plasmas. And so I became very familiar with plasmons through my laser plasma work. The people who work, there's a whole field of laser plasmas, they think what they're doing is very special. And they get very irritated with me when I tell them, well, I've got a plasma, it's in this pin, this metal pin, it's a plasma and I don't need a laser to create it. And so we've had plasmas ever since we've had metals. So that goes back quite a long time. I have been following the metal, I'll call it the metal optics field. I've been following that for a very long time. I had a keen appreciation for plasmons, and it's always been out there. But I would say an important step for me came in the year 2000 when I started my antenna company. So I started a company in 2000 to design and manufacture cell phone antennas. Eventually the company became very successful. So it was just a coincidence. That was radio. But the concepts, which I could not learn from the physics books, I already mentioned Jackson, the other books were not really of any use for understanding antennas. But I was forced to understand antennas, otherwise the company would have gone bankrupt. And so I put a lot of effort into it. And then by coincidence, that became a hot field in optics. But I had all the antenna knowledge with me by then, which I thought put me in a rather unique position. And so that's when I combined the optics with my antenna knowledge and tried to figure out what the limitations were and what could actually be done. I think it's just there. It's a concept that is needed in physics. It was needed, and so it's just part of physics now. Of course, there are some practical applications, but I would say mostly it represented a new phrase, photonic crystal, and we needed that in physics. And so that's become part of everybody's vocabulary. So in that respect, it's a great success. From the practical viewpoint, I think there might have been a little bit of hype in the early days of all the different things it could do. But the two-dimensional version is actually being used by Luxtera in silicon photonics. This is the silicon photonics company I started. And so it's part of data communications. We sell those chips to data centers. And it could be you're going to check your email today and you would have gone, your coupling mechanism would have been through a photonic crystal into the silicon photonics.